So I think it's been a pretty long day. I organize conferences in India, or rather, the company I founded and I run now. We organize about 7 conferences in India, and typically the last speaker always has it worse because you've got to really keep the audience engaged, and at the same time, people are tired. So I'm going to try and keep this short. My original plan was to essentially talk about the situation with data science in India, how Julia is positioned, and how do you design conferences around Julia that would sort of keep the conference relevant and therefore the community more engaged. But I think over the last few days that I've been in the United States and I've been watching the whole story of innovation and technology, I've decided to change the talk quite radically. So what I'll do in this talk is I'll divide it into 3 sections. I'll talk about the backstory of how we did the first edition of JuliaCon India, what led to it. So we've done one edition of JuliaCon India in October 2015, and there's one upcoming. So I'll talk about the story of how that happened and therefore how the community sort of emerged around that. I then talk about what would be the sort of tactical challenges for a young language like Julia, and what would be the strategic challenges for building both community and the language in the long term. So let's see where this goes. I'd like to keep this more open because I'm actually interested in seeing what kind of inputs come from the audience over here to some of the questions that I'm raising. About HasGeek, the company that my co-founder and I started, we're a 6-year-old organization in India, and my co-founder is a Python programmer, and one of the things that we recognized 6 years ago was that technology was developing so fast that the only way that you could actually learn about technology was from your own peers who were practicing and who were implementing, who were developing technology. So I was just talking to somebody over lunchtime and saying, like 4 or 5 years ago, it was very hard to find any educational institution that was actually producing front-end engineers by having a curriculum for front-end design. You either had to be a designer who had to learn programming, or you had to be a programmer who had to understand how to design for the browser. Similarly, today's interesting challenge, particularly in Bangalore, where I come from, is how do you get developers to understand statistics? How do you get them to do data science and machine learning? So what we're seeing with what's happening with technology is that it's getting both interdisciplinary. There are new challenges coming up, and educational institutions are not necessarily keeping up with these fast changes. And so the best way that we thought that developers could learn is by learning from their own peers. The other thing we recognized back in India was that if academia has a culture of peer reviewing research and new developments, then why couldn't we do the same thing in technology itself? So the whole purpose of starting this organization was to create this platform for software developers and to facilitate more peer-to-peer interactions and peer review in technology. And what we felt that we were actually out to do was to create communities around these emerging technologies and emerging challenges. So currently we organize about 7 conferences. There is JuliaCon, which is a conference around Julia. There is JSFoo, which is a conference around JavaScript. There is the 5th Elephant, which is a conference on data science and machine learning. There is 50p, which is a conference on payments, etc., etc. What's interesting is and I think this is it's a pretty landmark moment both for HasGeek as well as for Julia, is really how this collaboration happened as a result. We've been always saying that we want to build communities around emerging technologies, and here is one successful example of how it's actually happened. So one of the things that we do for all our conferences is we try to crowdsource the content, which is we get everybody to submit proposals about speaking, and these have to be proposals which are around open source technology, which are relevant to the theme of the conference, and they have to be about some practice or some problem that you've implemented. So let me try and show you the site where we accept talks. Right, so this one, for instance, is the submission site for JuliaCon 2016, but let's try to see another one. Right. Right, so this is a conference on the 1st of July on deep learning, and what we do is we define the theme and the kind of talks we are looking for, what are the options for submitting talks, and people can actually go about submitting a proposal which talks about what the talk is about, and things like that. And part of the reason why we decided to do this was because we felt that the only way to be able to actually find people doing interesting work is by being able to crowdsource this kind of content. And we've had a fair bit of success over a period of time where our conferences generate as much as like 100 proposals from 100 different people. And this is really how, and each conference is curated by an editorial panel, which consists of speakers who've spoken at past editions of the conference, individuals who have been attending the conference and who want to volunteer their time towards building good content. And that's also how the communities have grown around each of these conferences. And well, this is what happened in 2013 as a result of this whole submission process and through a lot of social connections. Viral decided to propose a talk on Julia, and not only did he propose a talk on Julia, but he also got in touch with us and said, what can we do? And I think for us as an editorial team for the Fifth Elephant 2013 was a very exciting moment, because you're like, oh wow, there's a creator of a language who's based out of Bangalore, and what better way to inspire people that, you know, this is how innovation happens, is by actually putting this person on stage. What we also did before the conference was we organized a hack night around Julia, where interestingly there were about 2 people, I think Viral, if he's in the audience, might be able to substantiate, is I think there were a couple of people who even sort of made a bunch of submissions to I suppose a bunch of libraries, and then we had a and I mean there were I think people sort of started committing code to Julia. And I think the whole momentum was very interesting and exciting. In 2013, Viral gives a talk. In 2014, he helps curate the conference. And what we do last year is we decided that, you know, we want to do this birds of feather session where we want to talk about R versus Julia. And the interesting thing that happens is that nobody wants to listen about R, everybody wants to talk about Julia. And we said, okay, boom, this is the right time to do a conference. So, and just about that time, Viral sort of comes forward and says, why don't we do this conference? And we're like, okay, this is great. So like, why don't we do this? I think the other interesting thing also is like over a period of time, there have been a bunch of symbiotic relationships that have developed with individuals around Julia. So Shashi, who just gave a talk right now, was the curator of the Fifth Elephant last year. He's also been, he's actually also contributed to a lot of code that we write for our conferences, and he's also been volunteering and speaking at other conferences. So, so I think the relationships sort of developed mutually, and this sort of became a good groundswell. And we did the first edition in October last year, where Stefan, Jeff, and everybody was there, and we had a pretty good turnout, almost as big as what we did here. Now, you know, having done this, one of the things that I've realized in organizing conferences, the first year is all very exciting and interesting. What happens in the second year? Either your expectations are too high and you're not going to meet those expectations, or people are going to come in and you don't know how the language is going to develop. And I think that's where I have a bunch of questions in terms of where the language is going, how are we going to go forward with building the community in India and in other parts of the world. And I think that there are two kinds of challenges that we have to take into account. Obviously, for there to be greater adoption for Julia, both in the applied sense as well as in generating more interest, there is a requirement for more libraries and packages. The other thing is, I'm sort of speaking a little more speculatively over here, is there's a requirement obviously for there to be more awareness and education about Julia in colleges and campuses. I know there have been some initiatives, and we've had a bunch of people presenting from some of the institutes about how they've been talking about Julia, but clearly there's a need for more facilitation, for more workshops, for more trainings and more learnings if the language has to sort of get more mainstream. The other interesting thing also for I think tactically would be, how do you get other communities to come forward and you know, use Julia for exploring the ideas. So for instance, Python has taken roots in the bioinformatics community, the math community, the ML community, and all of them use Python to explore their ideas. How do you get this to happen for Julia? Obviously, I think you know, apart from talking about just awareness and education, there's also a question about, you know, what are the tools available. I mean, what, you know, how does the community interact? How do people support each other? The tools are clearly not always enough, and how do you decentralize ownership? And interestingly, we had a talk this year about you know, how Björn Dirk, who's one of the creators of Isinger community, was talking about how the whole dynamics of just building the community together has been so interesting, and therefore that impacts who contributes, how much they contribute, etc. So I suppose these are sort of the general challenges of community building, and they obviously vary from community to community and context to context. But I think there are also bigger picture challenges which have sort of become a little more apparent to me as I've been sort of traveling through these different cities in the US in the last week. And I think one of the open questions for me is the kind of the structure and incentives in both startups as well as educational institutions for individuals to take up adoption of a new language or to innovate in the first place. So for instance, I mean, if you look at Shlomi Noak's work in booking.com, and now that he's moved to GitHub and the kind of work that he's doing with databases, would I even inconceivably imagine that happening in India in startups? I think that's a shift that needs to happen, where it's not just work for the sake of producing work or a warm body for the sake of doing work, but it's also about how do you create for a larger purpose, and how do you get individuals to be more interested in building technology for a much more larger purpose. Similarly, I think there is a disconnect in academic institutions in India where open source technology is often looked down upon, or when people talk about open source technology, professors come back and say, oh, are you copying stuff? So I think those structures and incentives need to change, and I think that's a much larger question both for education and for innovation. Also, what's interesting to me is when I sort of have been looking around what's happening here in MIT, it clearly appears that there is a role that both philanthropy and foundations have to play in developing in fostering more development of technology and creating innovation. We don't have such instances in India, and I think it's really about what can we learn from here and how do you implement this back in the country. How do you create more opportunities for awareness and education? I think that goes back to some of the more tactical challenges of growing the language. And I think the last question obviously would be diversity, and I think not just diversity, how do you make more opportunities for accessing and adopting a language, not just to people of different sexual orientations, but also people of diverse backgrounds, including socioeconomic backgrounds, race, caste, etc. So I think those are larger questions, and I'm more interested in engaging with all of you to talk about these questions on a one-on-one offline. For now, I'd like to announce the dates for JuliaCon India. That's 22nd of October, and if you're interested in attending the conference, traveling to India, you should definitely submit a proposal to speak, and hopefully you will be accepted. So that's it.